In this real-side experience, I would be in an observing capacity, not interjecting a simulated vehicle into the situation for my awareness to operate through, where interaction and direct engaging with the participants and a potential altering of the situation can be possible. Instead, from the position of the real awareness. A real awareness which is part of this everything isness reality, and so in essence, being this one everything isness through all consciousness, as it effects into all body forms and experiences. So everything that is transpiring in creation can be shown to the personal self, like selecting an idea from all consciousness, just as we might choose a movie to watch from a storehouse of all the movies ever made. And so I would witness an individual based on his appearance and that of the scene he was in. He evidently was a human, just a typical human going about his one-dimensional activities. Although impressions provided via the real awareness, as I said, a real awareness as a part of this isness everything that is through all consciousness and all the ideas it comprises of, and so every detail of every simulated situation we see can be made available if it is necessary for it to be so, to fill in a few blanks, as it were, information that the visuals alone perhaps might not provide. These impressions revealed he was an individual, in fact, that was aware to an extent, more so perhaps than the average human, although a process barely begun, and so there was much to be faced and released of his consciousness of ideas, and indeed the recognition of the ears, for him to be able to position himself as the being of light he actually is with the true reality. It seemed, however, that what he had decided, the choices he had made, had culminated now in the moment of his death, the very scene I was now observing, for everything is a choice, a decision, even the moment and manner of the death of our physical vehicles, and although still a relatively young man, I'd have placed him in his 40s. What he had set in motion, idea, agreement-wise, would now bring about his physical vehicle demise, although it was never made apparent as to precisely what killed him, as his body would just suddenly expire. Interestingly, moments prior to his body expiration, while he was still viewing his simulated physical level situation through his body vehicle sensory mechanics, he would be somewhat perturbed by the presence of two other individuals suddenly manifesting. For indeed, these individuals were exact replicas of himself, as though clones or doppelgangers. The replicas just seemed to drift about aimlessly, as though lacking a direction or purpose, though, as impressions suggested, these were extensions of his own consciousness, simulated forms effected from it. Being multi-dimensional, as we all are, we have the various body form vehicles throughout the life levels of creation. Our awareness animates through them all, but the body form and life level we experience directly and consciously would be where our focus and attention happens to be placed. On the physical level, we are locked into the consciousness mechanics that we experience only this densest of life levels, as though we're wearing a particular virtual reality headset with the simulated world it contains and the avatar we are operating through within it. On the demise of the physical body, the headset is removed, and we automatically will be positioned based on where we have effectively decided to be, with most having the focus placed with the physical and astral, the seat of the emotions and sensation body overwhelmingly. This is decision then to be limited to these areas, and so generally, as the physical body expires, as the physical level apparatus is removed, automatically will they be positioned astrally, a little like switching one headset, the physical, for another, the astral, and experiencing then the decided design of this next consciousness-affected life level, the various designated heavens of a man, the lower astral, etc. It was as though then, as I observed the moments prior to this man's death, it suggested the physical vehicle mechanics were already beginning a process of shutting down, and so it would be the equivalent of being in a position where one isn't fully on the physical, as that which affects the physical simulation is being slowly switched off, a little perhaps like the in-between state, as I call it, where one can be in a position awareness-wise, bridging between the physical and the real side, where despite being still in the consciousness as it affects the physical level, 1 foot or so is outside of the consciousness, so to speak, on the real side, and so elements of the real side can bleed over and feature on the physical level, as effectively our view is in 2 places simultaneously, and very likely then this would be a phenomenon experienced by those as the physical vehicle deteriorates, if slowly or slow enough to experience such, and not an instant death. As oftentimes people report seeing various beings manifest seemingly in their presence, while still on the physical during their body's demise, beings only they can see, as their awareness now is not limited to their physical level mechanics. In this man's case, he would see as though then aspects of himself, presenting as replicated versions of his own body form. He was aware to an extent, as I said. Most humans, physical, astral, focused only, as I mentioned, but suggesting here that this man's focus and awareness was more extensive, that reached then beyond the physical and astral, to perhaps the next position, literally speaking, the causal. For as we become more aware, and release that which limits us positional-wise creationally, we gradually can access more of that which we are, our multi-dimensional selves, and ultimately afford ourselves full access to everything we are effecting from consciousness, the physical to the ethereal, and potentially beyond that, into the real universes of the ears, our real self-being, the real awareness, is a part of. Indicating here, as I said, that this man had been on an awareness process to a degree, had effectively facilitated himself access up to the causal. He had 2 additional vehicles and subsequent life levels aside from the physical available, the astral and the causal. And I suggest this manifested for him here as seemingly the 2 duplicates of himself briefly featuring on the physical level, like in between state bleed-overs onto the physical level, although he didn't recognize these as being such. He simply reacted with the chosen and created emotion of alarm, and then his body vehicle expired, the physical level headset effectively removed, and onto the next position he would find himself, a position of his own choosing, as everything that we experience always will be. He was now with a group of other individuals, all appearing human also. All had equally met the demise of their physical body vehicles, and all were affiliated or associated with each other. Emotional attachment bound them, that effectively we might call them a soul group, as the reference generally used, whereas we look into the idea that is the body forms of others, we will constantly be experiencing the idea of them in our simulated experiences and lifetimes. For to hold to an idea, we always will effect it for ourselves, and as such, emotional attachments with others, regardless of the emotion applied, as the hatred for an individual clung to, will as readily hold the idea of the individual locked into your consciousness as the created emotion of love. This attachment will have individuals constantly experiencing as a group in various forms and assumed roles, lifetime after lifetime, until the attachments, the idea of the other individuals, are released. And this group of individuals were those most closely associated with the man who had transitioned, those he held most emotional attachment with, in other words. And so they all would have died also, not necessarily at the same time, as a time is somewhat different beyond the physical. But it was as though they had been waiting for this man, and now he was here. They all would greet each other warmly, maintaining their attachments therefore, and intended to head off in a particular direction, for the scene appeared to be a natural, open countryside setting of a kind. Seemed, however, it was prudent not to linger for long in this immediate spot following the death of the physical body, wherever it happened to be. For wherever it was, whatever the shared idea agreements with this group that had them effected here as their first position after the physical, it seemed to be a realm of monsters, despite the nature setting they were in. Maybe they were somewhat lower astral positioned at this point, the area of creation where those that make the most abysmal and poor life choices and decisions effect for themselves as positioning. The various demons, entities, reptilians, and so forth. Although the individual who had died and his group all had a more extensive awareness and a consequent unlocking of creational positioning, as I said, more access therefore, and although initially placed where they were, a kind of a crossover point from the general astral to the lower astral, hence the nature setting, but the potentiality of a monster infringement, so they were not limited and restricted to the lower astral, as the beings that dwell there are. But as I said, to linger on this threshold between the lower astral and the general astral areas posed an inherent monster-related risk. The group had waited for this man's transition, and the monsters had drawn close. Moments after the group's warm emotional attachment reception with the man, the scene was indeed now filled with monstrous beings and body types of various kinds and descriptions. There would be vampire-like beings, shambling fur-covered monstrosities, but the group would swiftly move out of harm's reach, proceed beyond the point where the monsters could trespass, self-limiting as the monsters were, and resigned to the lower astral, they could not move beyond it, and the group positioned themselves beyond the monsters' clawed clutches. And the scene would switch. If the group and the man had spent any time, so-called, in the astral, or maybe the causal, this period had been skipped to the moment where they now were seemingly preparing to return to the physical again. It's always a choice to return to physical embodiment. Potentially, one can stay in the astral or wherever they are positioned as long as they desire, but unless they continue with their awareness processes, if indeed they have even begun such, they can position themselves no further, a situation most will then experience, and ultimately will drift back to the physical. For after all, if they have not released the ideas of the consciousness, they are resigned to the effects of them. During each lifetime, we are forging the lifetime that is to follow. If we choose to remain consciousness and personal self immersed, every thought, idea, agreement, the phenomena we are enthralled by, the emotional attachments we enhance certain ideas with, so we are designing our next lifetime, a lifetime which will reflect all that which the consciousness comprises of, and any additional ideas we have agreed with and installed within its construct. And so, if we hold to the consciousness, we are locked into its effected design, whatever that may be, and our next physical position and body vehicle is then awaiting our awareness insertion. And so it was that this group, preparing to return to the physical, and even though the man who I had witnessed dying was more aware than his group, he was far from completing of his awareness process. Still attached to his consciousness was he, along with the attachments he held with his group. And what was taking place now was a kind of a body form selection process for the lifetime that was to follow. The lifetime this group would share in whatever roles they would assume in association with each other. It was all rather fascinating to behold, for indeed very apparent was it from my perspective view that this whole process was managed by the dark forces, or expressions of them. Ultimately the choices resided with the group, as it is with everyone, as we are the deciders of what we experience. But nevertheless, the dark force beings present were overseeing this body form selection process. It became rather apparent that the nature of the idea agreements and attachments the group shared, that whatever their consciousness construct had been that had affected them as human previously, that the additional ideas installed in the consciousness during their human lifetimes would be effecting for them body forms and creational positioning that was somewhat different. For the man and his group all were moving through what seemed to be a kind of mechanical series of chambers, although who can say how this appeared from the perspective view of the man and his group? And at each stage of this process, so a little more of the body form they would become would replace that which had been the human part. And as the body forms to be assumed gradually completely replaced the human forms, as the process reached its conclusion, so the body types of the group were very exotic indeed. The group now consisted of bipedal, walking wolves and felines. Some were dragonic, or more lizard-like. It was as though whatever the additional ideas that had been installed during their human lifetimes, so had it projected for the group that shared these ideas such body forms that, although not identical, what with the various animal expressions, they would be, however, sharing a creational physical level position, wherever that might be, and whatever roles they may assume in relationship to each other. I would suggest this was a form of emotional attachment the group had forged in regards to certain movie or entertainment phenomena that is dark force provided. Simply this, that as we watch what we do, if we are enthralled with it, so we forge the idea agreements and attachments, sometimes subconsciously, sometimes a conscious yearning to be experiencing that which we are watching movie or computer game-wise. And how many movies or computer games present characters which are anthropomorphic, bipedal, two-legged wolves, cats, etc. And it would seem that this group had created such emotional attachment to these sort of entertainment presented ideas, consequently they had projected for themselves a future lifetime together with these kind of alternative body forms. The group, in their soon-to-be assumed body vehicles, were joined by a larger body of individuals, also being processed through these curious mechanical stages and adopting similar exotic body forms also. For the ideas the group and the man shared that were to have them projected into wherever it was creationally and physically as these new body forms, were ideas not exclusively their own, as though many others, very likely human also, and captivated by similar entertainment depictions of such body forms, also had created these agreement and attachment ideas. And so it was that all these humans would be projected into some world or other where the species would seem to be an overall mixture of various animal-like two-legged body forms, and however that would work itself out as a world and as a social consciousness. Interestingly, the man who had died, as I said, was more aware than his group, and this afforded him additional options that his group would not have, as greater awareness tends to provide more options and opportunities. For although his group and the larger group now joining the scene were going through this process of a body form assumption as though on unconscious automatic pilot, the man's greater awareness afforded him more a conscious realization and a recognition of what was taking place. He was as though paying attention to everything as opposed to all the others present. For indeed, he seemed somewhat dismayed at the form he would be adopting, as though it wasn't to his liking. It was a kind of a bipedal, wolf-like body form, but to his reckoning, he didn't like that the snout wasn't long enough. He seemed very particular about the form he desired. And so, not only did his awareness allow him to be conscious of the process, and to be able to apply consideration to the proceedings, but that he afforded himself the option to as though start the process again, as though his consciousness was of such a design that he had various body form options, all along similar walking bipedal animal-like lines, but that somehow, as I said, his body form had come out not to his liking, and as he reinserted himself back into the first mechanical stage, as he went through the process again, but consciously, it seems he struggled to produce that which he craved to be, as though those going through the process of form assumption on unconscious automatic pilot had rather an effortless process. But as the man took conscious personal self-control of his situation, it was a struggle to manage a process that is usually taken care of by the real awareness. The real awareness executes the process with the tools it has at its disposal, the consciousness of ideas it has to play with as decided by the personal self, by which to make the best body form possible, like a lump of clay, and the extent of the clay's size or quality is dictated by the personal self and its free will decided consciousness construct. And so, by the time the man had completed the process, as his personal self had as though wrested control of it, the result was abysmal. He had created a kind of mutated conglomeration of various parts of assorted animal forms that would be very unproductive as an overall body type, far worse than the original form as orchestrated by the real awareness, based on the consciousness clay presented to it. His group in their assumed forms, and the others that had joined the scene, all were standing as though before a kind of a portal, and through this portal they all would enter, and would ultimately find themselves birthed into the world they all were to be a part of, as these exotic bipedal, half-man, half-animal forms. The man in his mutated form lingered, reluctant to go through the portal understandably, but then another being manifested, that impressions revealed was a real guide. For as I said, this man had begun his process of awareness, though clearly much by way of a consciousness emotional attachment and agreements were still to be addressed and released. But nevertheless, the guide had been featuring in his real side experiences, taking him slowly, step by step, and so the man would recognize this being as the guide that he was. The guide took him gently by his mutated arm, leading him away from the portal, and as he did so, the mutated form receded until the human form the man had previously been was restored. Where the guide took him was never revealed, but presumably, as I said, this man, through his greater awareness, had more options and opportunities, and so very likely the guide, with the man's agreement, was stepping in and overseeing a creational physical level positioning for the man that would make more sense, awareness speaking. Of course, if the man adamantly clung to his attachment with the sort of body forms his group and the others had assumed, the guide could do nothing for him, so it suggested the man was agreeable to perhaps relinquish such ideas, allowing that the guide could then assist him in such a manner. And there the experience would end, a reminder then that we always are the deciders of everything we experience, the worlds we are positioned on, and the body forms we operate through. That no other beings, no gods or dark forces are responsible for any of it, for our body forms, or the dictating of our fate, our effects. They may oversee such processes, but no being can impact our experience in any way unless we agree that they can. This would include the real guides, in that they can only assist us if we are open to them and agree that they can, as was demonstrated in this experience.
Okay, that was that, Kevin, and fun stuff. And yes, when we make funny choices, funny things happen, don't they? So yes, thank you very much. That was cool. Thank you. Scary movie. Scary.